Data persistence, or the ability to save player data in between play sessions, is essential for every game, and our Tycoon is no exception. That's why in this video I'll show you how to save your player data in the Tycoon. As you can see, I'm joining in, and all of the parts that I bought previously were saved, and so was my money. So stay tuned for that. Subscribe to my channel if you enjoy these videos and want to see other content like it. Comment any questions or suggestions down below and like the video. And also join my Discord server if you have any questions. Link is in the description. So make sure to watch the last video if you haven't. But without further ado, let's get into the video. So in order to save our players' data, we need to utilize the data store service. Well, we can't really use that in Studio in a normal like Roblox place. So first we got to go to game settings in home and then publish it. You can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name it Tycoon Video 8. And I'm just going to create the game. So now it's published. So now we can go back into our game settings, go into security, and flip this switch to enable Studio access to API services. So API services include data stores like it says here. So we can click save, and now we have access to our data stores. So now we can go into our player manager, so service script service player manager, and we can start adding some functionality. So I'm going to go to the very top of the script and define a data store service by saying local data store service equals game get service data store service. Now I have a couple of videos on the data store service if you're interested, so I'm going to kind of glaze over the functionality because the system we're going to be implementing today is almost identical to my advanced data store tutorial. But the first thing we want to do with our data store in order to save our data is get a store. So I'm going to name the store player data. It'll be equal to data store service get data store, and then you can put in string of whatever you want, but I'm going to call it player data. So this will get our current store where you can save our values for in between play sessions. So now let's define a few functions. Below my leaderboard setup, I'm going to make a function and call this local function load data. And this will be responsible for, you guessed it, loading data. It'll take in the player as an argument because we need to know which player to load the data for. And all we have to do here is say local success, comma, result equals pcall function. And then inside this function, we want to return player data get async player.user ID. So we're dealing with data stores, and data stores can error. That's why we're using pcall. Pcall catches the error and puts it into the result, and success determines whether it errored or not. And in our pcall, we're returning player data. So we're getting the player data for the current player, and the key that we're using is the player user ID. And when this is returned, it's put in the value of result. So if it's returned successful, result will be equal to the player data. If it's not successful, then result will be a string with the error message. So let's print that string if it happens. So we can say if not success, then we can warn. Warn is the same thing as print. It just has yellow text. We can warn result. So if our pcall, if our data grab is not successful, we'll warn with the error just to make sure we know what's going wrong. And then all we have to do is return success and result. So success, by the way, is a boolean if you didn't already notice, and result will be our value. And then below that, we can have a similar function, but this time it'll be local function save data. And we'll get the player and then also the data. So in our game, all of our data, our money, and everything else is going to be stored in a table. So that's why we only need this one value for the data. And then instead of using get async, we have to use set async here. So I'm going to say local success, comma, result equals pcall function, and then the function will be player data set async player.userid and data. So I'm using set async, not update async, because we really do not need the previous value. And you can use update async if you want, but I just don't see the need. So we're going to keep it like that. So all this does is sets the key of the player.userid to our data, and we can retrieve that with the get data up here. And then we can follow a similar process to what we did before. We can say if not success, then we warn the result. And then below that, all we have to do is return success, because we don't really need the result, since it will always be an error message since we're not returning anything. So now we can define session data by saying local session data equals a blank table. This will be the table that will hold all of our player data, with the keys being the player's user ID and the values being the data in the form of a table. And again, this is very similar to my advanced data store tutorial. Link is in the card in the top right and the description. So now we can go down to our onPlayerAdded function and implement our functionality. So we can say local success, comma data equals load data for the player. So this will get our data and whether or not it was retrieved successfully. And then we can say session data, brackets, so we're setting the key for our session data for the player.userid as the key, equals success and data, or a table, and I'm going to make this table a little bigger, and I'm going to say money equals 0, and then comma unlock IDs equals a blank table. So this is a lot. What we're doing here is we're saying if success, so if our data was retrieved successfully, then we return the data. So this is basically a shorthand for an if statement, and this or is basically saying else we give them the default value. So this default value is for a player who has no priorly saved data, and we're gonna start them from scratch. So money is pretty self-explanatory. That's your money. Unlock IDs we'll get to a little bit later, but for right now, all you need to know is that's how we'll be saving and loading the player's Tycoon. So now we have the session data infrastructure set up. We need to do a couple of changes. So go down to your get money function block, and we don't really need all of this leader stat stuff. All we need to do is return session data brackets player.userid dot money. So this just simplifies everything a lot. All we're doing is getting our player's current session data money, and we're giving it back. So we don't need the leader stats at all, because the leader stats should be responsive to our session data. It shouldn't be defining what our session data has or hasn't. So that's what we're doing. And then also we need to change our set money. So when we say if money, then money.value equals value, we can also say session data player.userid dot money equals value. So we're setting our session data money to our value whenever we set the money. And that's why it's useful to have these set money functions, because we don't have to change any of the actual functionality in our other scripts. We just have to add this extra line. And in reality, we can just put this up here. So move it to if value. So if the value exists, then we can set our money value. We don't really need to care about the leader stat that much. It can work on its own. And now we can go back up to our onPlayerAdded, and there's one more thing we have to do. Right now, when we call leaderboard setup, the value is always set to 0. So money.value is set to 0. But if the player joins with existing money, we want that to be responsive. So in our leaderboard setup, we're going to change our arguments from nothing to value, and then set money.value equal to value. And then down here in our onPlayerAdded, we can set leaderboard setup, and then for the parameters we'll send in, we can just say player manager dot get money for the current player. So this will get our money, whether it be 0 or whether it be saved data, and set it for our leader stats in the top right. So this is only the loading part of our Tycoon. Now we need to save our data. But to be honest, that's pretty simple. All we have to do is go down to our onPlayerRemoving function and say save data for the player. We want to save data for the player. And the data we want to save is in session data brackets player.userid. So we're referencing the player's save data in the session data that we set with our set money and we initially set with this little block right here. We reference that and we just save it. And most of the time that will work. But sometimes the game closes before this function can be called. So that's why we have to contend with this edge case. And we'll do that by making another function. And this will be function player manager dot on close. And this function will run when the game is closing. It'll make sure all of the players in the game, when the game is closing, their data saves. So that's pretty simple. We can just say for underscore player in iPairs players get players do, and all we have to do is just repeat the same line from up here. We can just do save data player session data player.userid. And realistically, you really could just say player manager on player removing, but I mean, I don't think it really matters. You can do it if you want. Actually, I'll do that. You can just change this to player manager.on player removing. But they both do basically the exact same thing. And so that should handle our edge case, but this function never gets called. So go up all the way to your player manager.start. And at the bottom, I'm going to say game bind to close. And then bind to close just binds a function to when the game is closing. And we'll just bind player manager dot on close. So when the game is about to quit, we save all the player's data just to make sure that it's all saved, even if on player removing doesn't actually get called. So now if we test it out, we should be able to get some money. So let me just spawn in the dropper and start generating some cash. So we have 10 money. We can close the game. And then we can try again. And you can see we have 15 money. And you'll notice I had a little like yellow warning in the bottom of my screen. And that's just because when you're in studio and when you're testing something like this, a lot of times both things fire. So when you're leaving in studio, on close is fired, but sometimes player removing is not fired. So it's really iffy to test, and that's why you have to enable this stuff. It's not enabled by default. So I would recommend testing this as little as possible and just make the code and try to bug test it before you run it, because it does take a while. What most people do is when they're testing this kind of thing in studio, they say if game get service run service is studio, then return end. So this basically says if we're testing it in studio, we stop this function from running, and that'll just prevent your game from lagging towards the end and prevent you from getting that message. You can see that. So you can leave this here. I find that sometimes your data does not save if you have this here and you're testing in studio, but when you're actually playing the game, I guarantee it should save all the time. Our money now saves. So now let's move on to our Tycoon, because we want our Tycoon's progress to save as well. Now, most of the time that would be quite challenging, but since our Tycoon is set up to publish topics to the button topic, and our unlockable is called this unlock function with a special ID, it's quite simple, because all we have to do is save the IDs that we get when our Tycoon unlocks something, and then republish them once they rejoin. So it's like you're basically saving frames of when the player achieves something, and you're time-lapsing through them when they rejoin to get them up to pace to redo all of our progress, but instead of redoing all of our progress in like the minutes and hours it took them, you redo it in the milliseconds that a computer runs. So let's get to doing that. Let's go to our player manager, and we want to add a function just like we did for get money and set money. We want to add function player manager dot add unlock ID. And this will take in the player and the ID that you want to add. This is pretty straightforward. First, let's get our player data by saying local data equals session data player dot user ID. And then we want to do something a little interesting. We want to say if not table dot find data dot unlock IDs and then ID. Then we want to do table dot insert data dot unlock IDs and then ID. So what this is doing is it checks for repeats and it makes sure we never add a repeat to our unlock IDs table. So it makes sure our ID is unique. So when we run this, it'll check if the ID already exists, and if it doesn't, we'll add it. And the reason we have to do this is because the Tycoon unlock function may fire the same time for multiple IDs if multiple unlock IDs are shared between a bunch of different parts. So we do not want to add those all together because it would lead to a pileup of a bunch of random useless IDs. And now we need to add a function to get our IDs, so you can just do local or function player manager get unlock IDs, and this will take in the player, and we can just return session data player dot user ID and then dot unlock IDs. And these are all pretty straightforward. So now we can go back into our Tycoon and implement it. So the actual saving of our unlock IDs is very straightforward. Go to your Tycoon unlock function, and at the very top, all you have to say is player manager dot add unlock ID, and we want to add it for our self.owner. So this is the player that owns the Tycoon, and then we want to pass in the ID. So I guess we don't have the player manager defined. Nope, I spelled it wrong. It's lowercase player manager. Whoops. So it's player manager add unlock ID self.owner ID. So this will add all our IDs, but when we load in, it won't actually load our IDs. But that's also pretty simple. So below my Tycoon init, I'm going to add a function. This function is going to be Tycoon load unlocks. And what we're going to do in this function is we're going to say for underscore ID and iPairs player manager get unlock ID, get unlock IDs for the self.owner, and I misspelled player manager again, do, and then so we're going to run through all of our IDs, and for each ID all we have to do is say self publish topic, and the topic name is going to be button, and then the ID is going to be ID. So all we're doing is simulating button presses, but instead of the player actually have to step on the buttons and get this topic to fire, we just fire them all in quick succession. So this may not be the most performant solution since we're spawning on all the buttons and we have to despawn them immediately, but honestly, it's very simple and it solves a lot of problems with a very simple function. So I think the simplicity well outweighs the performance deficit. And now all we have to do in order to call this function is literally just call it in the init function. So underneath lock all, and make sure it is underneath lock all, because we need to create the unlockables for the unlockables to respond to our publishing. We can say self load unlocks. And then that should be it. So let's try it out. So we have 15 money right now, and we can buy everything in the Tycoon. We can quit, and we can play again. But one problem is for some reason when you test it in Studio a lot of times, the on-close function or the player on-player removing just does not fire. So I'm just going to comment this out and comment that out if you have any problems. I'm going to try it again. So one problem with our implementation is the fact that it leaves the buttons. Now the easiest way to solve this is to make a separate component, and I'm going to name this component despawn. So I'm going to make a new module script and call this despawn. And this component will basically listen for the ID for our current part that it's attached to, and it'll destroy it once the ID has been published. So you can say local despawn equals a blank table, and then do our normal component setup. And then in our despawn init, all we have to do is say self.tycoon subscribe topic, subscribe to the button topic, and then the function we want to connect to will have the ID. And then all we have to do is say if ID equals self.instance get attribute ID, then self.instance destroy. And so this is a lot of extra code for not that much extra functionality, but you could also reuse this despawn component for, like, I don't know, maybe some construction tape or something when something's being built, and once it is built, you can destroy it. That's just an idea, but it just makes our implementation a little bit easier, because if we didn't do this, we would have to run through all the buttons in our Tycoon, and that would be a little less elegant of a solution. So now we can go to all of the buttons on our Tycoon. So I'm going to go to server storage template and then make a new tag in the tag editor plugin. I'm going to call this despawn and select both of my buttons, give them the despawn tag, and then go back to my original button and delete the line that says self.instance destroy, since our despawn will handle it for us. So if we play this, you can see the buttons are now gone. And if we were to reset our progress, the buttons would be there, and then when you pulled E to unlock them, they would also get destroyed. So if you are experiencing trouble with testing your data stores, first of all, just try getting rid of this line right here with the run service, because Roblox recommends doing that, but it doesn't really work for me. It does cause your studio to lag a ton. So once you're done testing your data store, turn off security, enable access to Studio API services just to keep your game running smoothly. And then if it really is bothering you, you can obviously go to File and then Publish to Roblox, and then play your game like in the browser like a normal Roblox game, and it works fine. Like this, you can see everything works perfectly over here. But that's it for this video. So I can officially say you have a working Tycoon. There's buttons, there's droppers, there's parts you can unlock, you can make money, there's a spawn point, there's Tycoon spawns, and lastly, your data saves in between play sessions. So you can expand this to your liking, you can add walls, doors, whatever you want. And I may or may not continue on this series depending on what comments or suggestions I get. So comment any suggestions down below for extra episodes of this series. But other than that, like the video and subscribe to my channel to watch other scripting videos. And I hope you have a nice day, and goodbye.